Hello everyone, and welcome to the 60th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Mr. Henry Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. A miserly curmudgeon hell-bent on padding his enormous fortune and controlling the town of Bedford Falls, Mr. Potter has entered the mythos of American cinema as one of the greatest villains ever to appear in a film, a dastardly and cruel representation of the dark side of capitalism, one where men and women alike, who are fueled by greed, abuse their wealth and power to improve the lives of themselves without regard for the lives that are damaged or lost along the way. In this video, we're going to explore the duality that exists within this film, one of the virtuous good battling against the wholly selfish evil, as well as what the characters of George Bailey and Henry Potter are meant to represent, using this information to discern what exactly makes Mr. Potter such an effective villain. Before we start looking into Mr. Potter, I'd like to talk about our sponsor for this video, Audible. As some of you may already know, I'm a big fan of Audible, and for good reason. Not only do I use Audible to find and listen to new and exciting titles in my free time, but having access to any book I need to read to cover certain characters in spoken word form is incredibly helpful, as you can utilize Audible from anywhere and on virtually any device. Their expansive library is host to an unmatched selection of audiobooks and podcasts from any genre you can think of, and Audible also produces their own original content, much of which you can access totally free by signing up for the Audible Plus membership package, one that I highly recommend, as not only will you have access to these free Audible originals each month, but you'll also earn a credit each month that you can use towards anything in the Audible library. I recently started listening to Mistborn, The Final Empire, by Brandon Sanderson, which is a heist story set in a fantasy world, one where our hero attempts to steal from a hero-turned-villain that now rules over a vast dark empire as a god, making it a fun and unique take on both heist and fantasy stories that I highly recommend you pick up. Right now, you can try Audible free for 30 days by going to audible.com/Vile and using the code VILE at checkout, or by texting VILE to 500-500. And as an added bonus, you can enjoy 60% off your Audible membership for the first 3 months of your service. And with the holidays fast approaching, Audible makes a great gift for yourself or someone you love. So go to audible.com/Vile and use the code VILE at checkout, or text VILE to 500-500 to start enjoying some old favorites and pick up some new titles for your library today. Thank you, Audible, for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. A backstory for Mr. Potter is non-existent, but we are privy to one crucial detail about his personal life that adds to the image he projects as a deeply hateful man: the fact that he's never married, has no children, and lives alone. During the scene where Mr. Potter is attempting to persuade George into selling the building and loan, Mr. Potter remarks how virtually everyone in the town of Bedford Falls hates him, and he in turn dislikes all of them. We don't know why or when Mr. Potter began to resent nearly every human who crossed his path, but it's clear that at some point, Mr. Potter came to the conclusion that no one in this world mattered more to him than himself. And he has no regard for the feelings or well-being of anyone, viewing people as nothing more than a means to an end, minds to be manipulated, hearts to be won over with bribery and coercion, and tools to be used and discarded at will in service to his own desires. With that in mind, it's easy to see how Mr. Potter has ended up as a lonely old man, one who's content to stew in his own spite-filled existence. And I do mean content. As though Mr. Potter is called out for what he is a few times in this film, he doesn't seem to be bothered by the monikers people apply to him by any means. Rather, it's the exact opposite. Being this stone-hearted old man seems to bring Mr. Potter a certain amount of joy, and while we don't find him showing any sort of over-the-top elation when inflicting misery upon others, he does display a smug sense of satisfaction whenever he's in the midst of one-upping the people around him. That's not to say he's a sadist. Rather, it would be best to describe Mr. Potter as apathetic, a man who is immune to the suffering or needs of anyone other than himself. It's this attitude that has caused Mr. Potter to ascend to the position he currently occupies, financial overlord of the town of Bedford Falls, a position that affords him the luxury of being the ultimate decider of the fates of the people who live in his domain. At the start of this story, Mr. Potter didn't own everything in town. But as George points out during the same conversation I mentioned earlier, Mr. Potter was afforded the opportunity to swallow every last piece of business and real estate in Bedford Falls, save for the building and loan, by the economic catastrophe that was the Great Depression. An event that allowed him to seize everything in Bedford Falls by promising to assist its residents with their financial woes, by purchasing their businesses and homes, or by giving them loans from his bank, thereby ensuring that not only would their properties and livelihoods belong to him, but their very lives, as they became indebted to him without any hope of escaping his grasp. Now, Mr. Potter virtually owning the entire town of Bedford Falls wouldn't have been such a terrible thing if it weren't for the sad reality that the majority of the profits that Mr. Potter sees from the many business endeavors he's engaged in end up in the one place that they can do no good for others: his bank account. What little money Mr. Potter does allow to flow back into the community is spent building slums or transforming more reputable businesses into shady enterprises designed to enrich Mr. Potter even further. Mr. Potter has no empathy, sympathy, or compassion, and if a man were drowning right in front of him, I imagine Mr. Potter would ask him for $1 before extending his hand to help him. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to share with you a theory of mine. This film, as you know, is a Christmas film, and specifically, a Christmas film with religious themes. Now, you might be asking why that's important. Well, that's because it was hard for me not to notice that this film seems to have a couple allegories built into it. Namely, that though George is not a complete representation of Jesus, in some respects, he has Christ-like qualities, and Mr. Potter, in some respects, has traits commonly attributed to the devil. Now, Mr. Potter, like the devil, is resentful of humanity. The devil is prideful, jealous, and covetous, just as Mr. Potter is, and we see Mr. Potter employing a tactic that can be said to be the devil's main advantage in coaxing mankind into sinning: temptation. However, Mr. Potter doesn't use temptation to turn men into sinners. Instead, he uses it to lure them into satisfying his desire for power, control, and wealth. In order to do so, he puts on a disguise, one of the good-natured businessman, simply looking out for his interests and the interests of others. After all, is it not reasonable that a business should attempt to maximize profits over everything else? Mr. Potter certainly thinks so, and he does a good job of convincing others that this is true. And of course, there's the scene where he tries to tempt George into selling the building and loan with a large sum of money, adopting a sweet and caring tone, his words laced with honey, as he attempts to worm his way into the last vestige of good left in Bedford Falls. I imagine this is how he managed to convince a great many people to sign over their lives to him, as temptation, in such a form, isn't an easy thing to overcome. Now, in stark contrast to the devilry of Mr. Potter is George Bailey. George is an upstanding citizen, a good-natured man who was taught to love thy neighbor and help thy brother in their time of need. And though George is a selfish person who complains about the poor hand they've been dealt, he does have a strong moral compass that doesn't allow him to abandon his family and their business in their time of need. He comes off as bitter about this at points, as I imagine many of us would be about having to abandon our dreams, but George sacrifices a great deal of his own personal health and happiness to help others. And in the same way that Jesus was said to be the savior of mankind, George stands as the one bastion of goodwill and compassion against the encroaching avaricious business empire of Mr. Potter, the savior of Bedford Falls, who keeps it from falling into a haven for debauchery and greed. So with all this in mind, I would argue that one of the undertones present in this film is a battle between Christ and sin, George and Mr. Potter. And considering the overarching religious themes in this film, I believe this theory has some merit to it. But again, I could be wrong, so feel free to let me know down below. Now, everything negative that Mr. Potter's done to Bedford Falls is in a way abstract. We know he operates slums, gives people no leeway when it comes to financial obligations, and that he's a miser who pays people poorly. But other than hearing about what he does, we have few examples given to us directly in the film of his misdeeds, as for the most part, we only see his intent to cause misery for others. However, we are given a visualization of the harm Mr. Potter would do to Bedford Falls should he get his hands on the building and loan when George is experiencing the world as if he were never born. Cabarets, nightclubs, and bars replace nearly every small business in Bedford Falls. The people are meaner, the atmosphere more hostile, and the general feel of small-town America has evaporated into what would be called Pottersville. Now, the thing about this so-called horrid vision of Bedford Falls we're given is that depending on your own personal morals, having a bevy of cabarets, nightclubs, and bars open up in your town might not be that big of a deal. But to the majority of people watching this film when it was released, I imagine this was indeed a horrible vision of the future, a tearing of the moral fabric of their country, especially if you're a religious person. But if you're not, you may not find a Bedford Falls filled with these seedier businesses much of an issue. What is an issue, though, is the fact that Mr. Potter likely opened these businesses at the expense of others, as I'm sure that the owners of these transformed businesses were given a bum deal when they were taken over by Mr. Potter, and I'm sure they didn't have much of a chance of staying open, and if they did, they were likely strong-armed into giving in to his demands, just as Mr. Potter attempted to do to the Bailey family many times over. Then, of course, is the fact that Mr. Potter still operates slums in this alternate timeline, and the prosperity of Pottersville is still put to the wayside in favor of enhanced profitability. And this reality is but a reflection of the world that Mr. Potter is actively trying to create with every action he takes. Though we aren't shown the consequences of Mr. Potter's business dealings in detail, we do see Mr. Potter committing at least one crime when he steals the $8,000 left behind by Uncle Billy, an act done to sabotage the building and loan by rendering it delinquent in its accounts and subject to scrutiny by a bank examiner, thereby ruining the building and loan. But Mr. Potter doesn't succeed, and though as far as we know, he was never brought to justice for his crimes, perhaps it's justice enough that he should live out the rest of the few days left to him, just as miserable as ever. A lonely old dragon sitting atop a pile of wealth. Wealth that can hardly be called a replacement for any semblance of human connection. And at this end, who was Henry Potter? He was a penny-pinching cheapskate who sought to dominate the town of Bedford Falls through complete ownership of all properties and businesses therein. A modern-day Scrooge who couldn't see past his blind hatred towards anyone and everyone to treat people with any sort of compassion. He was cruel, facetious, cynical, and above all, greedy. A man who was willing to doom the lives of the people in his town to a poverty they couldn't hope to escape. A poverty designed by Mr. Potter to keep these people in a state of veritable slavery to his will. Mr. Potter may not have been a criminal in the traditional sense of the word, but he was undoubtedly a man who dedicated his life to swindling others by overwhelming them with the sheer amount of resources available to him, condemning the lives of thousands to misery and despair as they languished under the ever-present shadow of the man whose fingers perpetually tugged at their purse strings. A constant presence, sitting high on his throne, taking with both hands from those who have little to give, to line the pockets of a man whose wealth could last him several lifetimes. A man who somewhere along the way found that the lives of others meant nothing to him at all, and that he was content living a near constant reality of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Mr. Potter? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, and to my patrons, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.